Kaieteur Radio, keeping you informed.
Demerara and Essequibo 99.1 FM.
Berbice 99.5 FM. Kaieteur Radio.
Coming up next, Guyana's Oil and You, with editor and journalist at Kaieteur News, Miss Kiana Wilberg, and her co-host this evening will be Mr. Glenn Law, publisher of the Kaieteur News, and her two special guests.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of Guyana's Oil and You. I'm your hostess, Miss Kiana Wilberg of Kaieteur Radio and Kaieteur News. And tonight we have with us three distinguished gentlemen. We have the publisher, Mr. Glenn Lau. We have chartered accountant and attorney at law, Mr. Christopher Ram. And we have director of financial analysis at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, Mr. Tom Sanzillo. Gentlemen, welcome to the program tonight. We have a very hot topic, and that has to do with the impact of tax concessions granted to oil companies in the Stabroek Block, being Exxon, Hess, and Sinnock, on Guyana's share of profit oil. Now, the Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, of which Mr. Tom Sanzillo is its Director of Financial Analysis, produced a report which says Guyana's tax giveaway puts essentially a dent in its actual take from the Stabroek Block oil resources, from its profit oil. And what the IEEFA is actually contending is that instead of a 12.5% take, Guyana is actually walking away with a 9% take. With that being said, Mr. Sanzillo, I'd like to welcome you to the program again and ask that you explain for us how the Institute arrived at this conclusion.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me on again. And well, we were looking at this, and from my past visits, you know, we've been assessing the contract, and this is a part of the contract that is sort of outside the revenue and expenses that we normally looked at, and instead you have a separate transaction. And the way the rules are set up is the Exxon and Hess and Sinnock, they owe taxes to the Guyana government when they make revenues in the country, just like anybody listening here would pay their taxes. And they owe a certain amount, and the change comes about because the government has agreed that they would pay those taxes, that tax liability, as part of the agreement. So the government makes that payment, presumably, and that reduces they make it from their profit, from the profit oil. So the Guyana is supposed to get 12.5% of any of profit oil. That's kind of how the formula works. But when you reduce it by the tax amount, you come up with approximately a 9% take on it. And it's an attempt, the research is an attempt just to isolate that, to make the point that there is a loss of revenue, and And perhaps the next point to be made is that really was not part of the public discussion and debate. And instead most of us were told it was 12.5%, and that's kind of what you expect. But then there are these hidden kind of things that come about later because of the way in which the contract was constructed.
Thank you very much for that. Now, Mr. Ram, I'd like to turn the floor to you because I know that you're one of the staunch advocates for Guyana getting a fair deal from the Stabroek Block Agreement. And you have also spoken from time to time on the loopholes in the contract, and particularly the fact that Guyana has to pay the oil company's income taxes from its share of profit oil. So, Mr. Ram, given what was explained by Mr. Sanzillo, what is your take? Do you believe there is an impact when we have to pay the income taxes on our profit oil? Do you think there's an impact?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Let me start by saying the assumption that Guyana gets 12.5% consistently is something I have a problem with. If you read Article 11.4 of the contract of the petroleum agreement, what Guyana gets is 50% of profit oil, and the contractors get 50%. Where the 12.5% comes in is if profit oil, as a result of the deduction of recoverable expenses, were to fall below 25%, that becomes a floor to the profit which Guyana can get.
Exactly.
What happens is this. All recoverable costs incurred by the contractors are deductible for purposes of the agreement. However, if the deductible expenses for any accounting period is more than 75%, the deductible expenses are capped. The agreement calls it recoverable expenses. That's capped at 25%, at 75%, leaving profit oil for that period at 25%, and that's how you get to 12.5%. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second point I'd like to make, and I have written in columns that I think is 15.4, it's a fraud on the revenue of the United States or wherever. Because what happens in terms of the taxation, no cash moves. There is no movement of any cash.
Correct.
What happens is that the government says to the oil company, or if you would like me to go through the process, the oil companies prepare their tax returns, they give it to the minister, and whatever tax liability arises out of the tax returns, or tax return, the minister says, look, out of my share of profit oil, I am paying the taxes for the oil companies, for the contractors, out of my share of profit oil. What that does, it reduces the share of profit oil, you could say, but it increases the tax revenue. So that what this means is that it moves from one government entitlement to another government entitlement. No money goes out. So the government still gets its 2% royalty. And as you said, Guyana, I'm not happy with the contract, but I can only explain it what it is. The government gets its 2% royalty, and it gets the 12.5% share of profit oil at a minimum. If we were to look at the transactions to date, and Kaieteur News some time ago had reported on the revenues by the government, and it actually worked out to much more than it was in excess of 15%. Now, questions have been asked about that and about the transparency. But at no time is the government going to get less than, I know we talk about 14.5, it's really 14.25 because it's 25% of 98 after the royalty, but that's all right. At no time should we get less than 14.5. The tax matter is not a cash flow. What it is, the minister tells the Guyana Revenue Authority, look, out of my profit oil, I am paying these taxes. You give me a certificate saying, not that I paid the taxes, but that the oil company paid the taxes. So to that extent, I think it's a fraud. But it does not reduce the government's stake under the agreement. That's my contribution.
Thank you, Mr. Ram. Mr. Lal, I know that you have been an avid follower of the perspectives shared by both Mr. Sanzillo and Mr. Ram on what Guyana's take is and the impact of concessions and other loopholes. What's your take on what these two gentlemen have presented? Because I do know that you also have your program that you speak on where these matters are concerned.
With respect to Mr. Zanzilo and Mr. Ram, I just cannot agree with Mr. Ram when he says that Guyana has not lost and Guyana is getting what says in the contract. I cannot, he needs to explain to us, if we are not getting Exxon's rightful share of taxes, then how are we coming out a winner? I cannot fathom that. Because Exxon is walking away with their flush 12.5%. And Guyana is left. If Guyana is paying Exxon taxes, then where is that money? You're losing from your pocket if Exxon walks away with it. So if you lose money from your pocket, then it's simple. We are losing according to Mrs. Zanzilo, we are losing the 3%. So our share has to go down from 12.5 to 9. So that's kind of a little baffling for me. So I don't know what's Mrs. Zanzilo's take on that.
Mr. Sanzillo, what's your take to the opposing view that
I listened very carefully to Mr. Ram, who understands this pretty well. And I think he accurately described how the transaction works under the contract. But if Exxon, but this is separate and almost outside the contract in that respect. And if Exxon was a taxpayer like you are in Guyana and was asked to pay that taxes and was compelled, to pay that tax, then the revenue would come in based on that. And yes, he's right. The Guyana, in effect, doesn't lose anything per se. It retains the 12.5, but there is a payment that is foregone. I think it's a foregone payment. And if it was collected, then there would be a revenue increase for Guyana. And I think that's the difference. I think the technical explanation that he gave is correct, given the envelope of the transaction. But what this tax matter does is kind of an extra contractual agreement that occurs outside that the cost recovery scheme that Mr. Ram accurately presented.
I agree with that.
Mr. Ram, you're still there with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, is there an opposing view that you, or any other clarification that you would like to make based on what was said thus far?
Well, I think Mrs. Angelo agrees with what I said. I'm just reading that no money goes out, and I don't understand anyone saying that money goes out. I agree this contract is a bad contract. There's no question about it.
Okay.
I think that's a universal belief. But what we are talking is about the hypothetical if Exxon had paid taxes. The fact is they have not paid. And that to me is a violation of the law. But that's not to say that Guyana gets the 12.5 less something. No, that's not so. In any case, even the government take, and I think, is it Mr. Zanzalo?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't think we are stuck at 12.5 because you have the royalty, and government take includes royalty.
Sure.
In oil transactions, in petroleum contract, government take includes taxes and so on. The fact is this, Guyana, if we had not foregone, as Mrs. Angelo had said, we would have got more.
Exactly.
That does not mean that because we have foregone, we got less.
Yeah.
We still get, we still get our minimum of 12.5 and our royalty. So it's never even 12.5. It's a total. If you take the definition of government take in petroleum contract, it's what the government gets. Now, Mr. Lal is saying that yes, we lose, but you lose it as part of government. You lose it as part of tax. You retain it. Government, it doesn't change. There is no cash flow. No money goes out from the government. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying, Guyana. And I mean, I have written that I think this is a fraud on the tax revenue of any country which recognizes this certificate of tax paid by presented to them by the oil company. Also, which is why I've suggested to the media in Guyana, write the Guyana Revenue Authority and ask, through the Commissioner of Information, ask whether a certificate of tax paid has been issued, and if so, how much. They're bound to disclose that under the law. Look, I have studied this thing for a long time. We have not lost, and I want to make it clear, the performance so far, and this is because, you see, the 12.5, Mr. Zanzalo, becomes critical depending on oil price. And now, if you have a higher oil price, and I think I saw figures done by various persons, if you have a higher oil price, there's no need to apply the threshold of 75%. If you have a higher oil price and you don't have excess recoverable costs brought forward. What the other problem we have is that we do not apply the ring fencing principle. It doesn't matter that ring fencing is not provided for under the contract or the petroleum agreement, but in the issuance of either an exploration license or a production license, the minister can set conditions, whatever conditions he wants. And the oil companies can say, I am going with that condition. And he say, okay, well, if you don't go, that's it. So we can, our problem, moderator, is that even the agreement that we have is not being followed. Local content. The law requires local content. And you hear these jokers talking all the time, oh, we can get it before year end, or we can get it this and we can get it that. The law requires it. So let me put, in my view, and I have to say, and I'm glad Mr. Zanzalo, we return that that's the minimum we do get. The tax is what is foregone. It's not what somehow is pulled from somebody and given. They do not walk away with it, walk away with the tax. They walk away with a piece of paper saying that they have paid these taxes, which they haven't paid.
Can I?
Yes, Mr. Lowe.
Chris, I do agree with you, and I agree with Mr. Zanzilo. What I want, and I think Mr. Zanzilo actually said what I want to say here now. Guyana has lost. We have lost. I don't know how you want to twist it or turn it. Once your neighbor supposed to be giving you taxes, my friend, and you did not collect that taxes, Guyana has lost. And that's my stand, and that's my take on this. I agree technically what you're saying, that, hey, Guyana still get 12.5%. But at the end of the day, Exxon walks away without giving us our rightful share.
But that's a different thing from saying that we only get 9%, Glenn.
Yeah, but Chris,
that's different.
Chris, when a man walks away without paying me in my pocket what he's supposed to be paying, I consider that a loss from my home.
Well, please feel free to consider that and accept, and I accept that as your moral position.
And I
am talking about the contractual position.
Yes, but I also think Mr. Zanzilo said the exact thing that I'm saying, and if I'm wrong, I'll ask him to respond to that.
I think you don't have to. I don't think there's really a whole lot of a disagreement here. I would suggest that there are two separate things that we're talking about. There is an accounting process that Mr. Ram appropriately spelled out, and that's absolutely correct. There is a separate view of revenue collection for Guyana. That is a separate world, and I think we agree that the taxes were not paid, they were due and owing, and they were not paid. Exactly. And so that's really the issue from my point of view, because the promise to Guyana is that there would be a maximization of revenue for Guyana. This is clearly not a provision of the contract that encourages that maximization. It encourages, as an overall, a kind of a misleading approach to it. But on the technical aspects of the contract, that's correct. They get 12.5%. But I'm looking at the revenue picture. You know, I'm a former government controller, and I had to worry about balancing budgets. So I kind of know where the nickels and dimes go. You know, and I'm really was concerned about that. And there are several other areas, but I have another sort of a question that I can't quite get at, which is the government keeps stating that there is like 388 million in the U.S. dollars in the fund, the national fund, and I don't quite understand if the payments to the banks for the fees to manage it, and if these tax payments were actually transferred, I think is the right word, transferred from that account to the government's accounts, budgeting accounts, why that's not registered there, and is that 388 million US dollars really available for the budget, or is there some other claims that we know about on it and it's less? That's the transparency question that I think flows from this tax issue for me.
Mr. Ram, and on that note, Mr. Ram, I'd ask you, based on your knowledge of all that has transpired about the Natural Resource Fund, should the taxes that we're paying on behalf of ExxonMobil, should that be included as part of the payments from the oil sector into the Natural Resource Fund?
Well, are you then asking that the government takes it from a domestic account and put it in the Federal Reserve Bank because it still goes to the government.
No, that's not the point. That's not the point. The question is, are you having, from your accounting point of view, is there a proper accounting?
No, you're asking a different question from what Guyana is asking. I understand you. Guyana is saying, do we transfer? That's all. That I would say is creative accounting. To get to Mrs. Anzalo's
That is a problem.
question.
That's right.
To get to Mrs. Anzalo's question.
Right.
What has happened, and I'm sure you're following our politics, and if you think U.S. politics difficult to understand, try Guyana politics. There was a no confidence motion in Guyana in the government of the day at the time. Subsequently to that period, to the no confidence motion, but whilst that government was still in place, it passed a Natural Resource Fund Act. The Natural Resource Fund Act has a lot of bells and whistles, lots of controls, although it does give the minister what I would think would be undue power. The money is put in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It is monitored and managed by the Bank of Guyana. The Bank of Guyana issues periodic statements to say, this is what the money was at the beginning of the quarter, this is the negligible interest we got, and this is the balance. Unless we're going to doubt what the Bank of Guyana has said, the money is accounted for.
That's not my question. My question is, there have to be payments to the bank for their services. Who paid that? There had to be a payment, a transfer made from somewhere in the government for the tax payment. Was it made from the fund to the government? In which case, I'm at a loss as to the appropriate accounting of the money, and whether or not, therefore, that 388 million US dollars, not that it isn't there, it is there. I'm not questioning that, not in the least. I want to know if it is actually available for budget purposes, or are there other claims on this money that would reduce the 388 to some other number because the taxes have to come from somewhere, and because the fees have to be paid for the banks. And so it's just the accounting of that money. I'm not saying that the money isn't there at all. I hope I was not clear on that. That's not what I'm saying at all. There is 388 million US dollars that are there. The question is that available for government budgeting purposes? I'm a controller. I want to know, can you use it for the people of Guyana, or are there other claims on that money? That's really my question.
Well, the money can be withdrawn in accordance with the procedures set out in the Natural Resource Fund Act. Now, because it's an intergenerational saving and infrastructural and inflationary, as I said, there are lots of mechanisms in place, technical considerations. So it ought not to be, if the act is followed, then there ought not to be any exposure of that account to any claim. The money can only be withdrawn from the fund in accordance with the act. In accordance with the act. Now, what happens, the way it works, part of it comes into the consolidated fund. And from the consolidated fund, it goes into the annual budget and then spent. But the money from the bank itself is subject to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is very restricted. What has happened so far, and I will tell you the politics. So the government of Guyana, the current government, after the change of government, said, look, We didn't agree with this act. We think it's illegal since it was passed during a time when we had a lame duck government. And say they do not want to trigger the mechanisms for any withdrawal. So what is happening is the account keeps getting augmented by the royalty payment and the profit oil. But the withdrawals are strictly in accordance with the Act. As of this date, there have been no withdrawals from the fund.
Mr. Ram, I'd just like to ask a question on that. Since the fund it consists of the royalty and our share of profit oil, therefore the taxes of the oil companies, that is considered part of that.
Exactly. That's the question I wanted to
Sorry?
ask.
That is what?
Sorry, I was asking, since you noted that the royalties and the profit oil is part of the natural resource fund account, it therefore stands to question that the payment of the income taxes would have to come from the profit oil.
But we agree that it's a book entry, it is not an actual payment. Right? So what happens, and it's a good question, the money in the natural resource fund remains untouched by that transaction.
So it therefore means that...
Okay, can I finish?
Sorry, go ahead.
The question of the taxation is the Commissioner General is now being asked to say that he has received this
Taxes.
this nominal tax, not nominal in amount, but nominal in the sense that it's not actual. He is saying he has received this. So, interestingly enough, his tax revenue, and it's going to be interesting for us to see how the government accounts for it. When the minister first issues a certificate, this is the year he will have first issued a certificate. It sounds to me that what will happen, he will say that the GRA will record that they have received this non-cash payment of taxes, of corporation tax. So he shows it, his numbers go up, even though it does not mean his actual cash goes up. And what happens, as you know, the revenues collected by the Guyana Revenue Authority are transferred generally on a monthly basis to the Ministry of Finance to be put in the consolidated fund. So the money all he will say is, these are the taxes I've collected. Some of it will be nominal, some of it will be actual.
So we can therefore say that the taxes for the company, the oil companies, they've been paid for because it's already part, we have to consider it as part of the Natural Resource Fund.
No, it is not part of the Natural Resource Fund. The Natural Resource Fund is only the royalty and the share of profit oil, nothing else. And the withdrawals are what comes out based on what the committee established under the Act approves for transfer to the consolidated fund. It's a little bit of a, accountants have very creative ways of doing things. The GRA says it has received payment that it has not received.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not that it has given oil company X any money. It gives them a certificate.
May I?
But I do want, Mr. Zanzillo, I do want to clarify, there is no figure of 12.5% that is the rule. It is the minimum payment because of the restriction of the recovery of the expenses.
Yes, that's my report says that. Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
But Chris,
I don't disagree with that. It's a minimum payment.
But Chris, if I'd like to hear you on this. If, according to Mr. Zanzillo, we carried a story just a few days ago in which he says Guyana is losing, at present, I think it's $348 million yearly on taxes, what Exxon should have been paid. It means that money is in the Natural Resource Fund. If that money isn't transferred to GRA, then where is that money?
The money is in the natural resource
And
in the Federal Reserve Bank.
Yes. It's a gimmick. It's a gimmick.
That's right. It's merely a paper entry.
Yes.
Yeah,
It's a
but-
gimmick.
yeah,
but I have another. I mean, the money is money. The contract says that the tax payment comes out of the profit oil.
Mhm.
The statute says that money can be paid out of the fund for banking fees. It doesn't say anything about paying taxes. So I think I agree with Mr. Ram there that there is probably something not correct. But it, nevertheless, from a standpoint of basic accounting, I agree with him that there is a transactions taking place that are on paper. But someone needs to account. And when you have outside reviewers like the IMF and the World Bank and others who are looking at your cash situation, they're going to want to know, is that money in that account available for your budget purposes? And the answer, as far as I can see, is that it is not. And that
That's not correct. That's not correct.
There is a tax bill. I didn't cut you off. Please don't cut me off. There is a tax liability that is attached to that fund, and there are payments to be made to a bank for services under that fund. Now, you can pay it from someplace else, but it nevertheless reduces the amount that the government would get unless they receive the payment directly from the oil companies.
Exactly.
That is just a fiscal fact, notwithstanding the accounting trickery that is being employed here. That is a fiscal fact.
I don't know whether you're fully aware.
I've been in charge of government funds for 26 years. I know every trick in the book, Mr. Rand, and I just don't. I see your point, and I do not disagree with one point you're making about accounting. I totally disagree with what's available to Guyana for revenue purposes.
Exactly.
That's our disagreement. And the public should, in my view, the public should understand that needs to be explained. I agree with you 100% on all of your accounting points. You're correct. Except I might say that I think the profit oil, the contract and the statute are probably in a bit not aligned. But we could discuss that, but it's kind of like we'd lose your audience, I think.
Mr. Ram, you
No.
had a view to
Yes.
offer?
I'm not going to claim any special right of knowledge. All I am saying is the Petroleum Exploration and Production Act and the order published by the minister and tabled in the National Assembly does allow for what is taking place. Now, Mr. Lal is saying that, okay, if you walk away with $2 billion of taxes, then the government gets cheated. That is true even of a tax evader. So all the people in this country who evade taxes, you can say the government is being robbed. And that's a fact. And that is probably more criminal, though it might not be as immoral as what we have done. We have crazily signed on to an agreement, and there are persons who are not even sure that the minister had a right to do what he did. It is quite possible that the minister exceeded his authority. And there is an abundance of cases around jurisdictions where ministers, especially when you don't have an alert public and an alert parliament, where ministers exceed their authority. There's a view that the minister has exceeded his authority in this matter. But so far as the agreement is concerned, which is why we have got to attack the agreement, it's not what we morally think is right or wrong. Let's look at this agreement. Let's look to see what is wrong with it, what is illegal with it, attack it. If it comes out, if the court rules that, look, the minister exceeded his authority in this matter, then the court will have to say, look, you cannot continue wrong, whether private or public international law or whatever you want to say. The court, so we need the court to deal with this matter. The problem is, Guyanese keep shouting out all the time, and there are very few people who wish to take this matter to the judicial review. Because if we don't do it, we will be spending the next 40 years. Remember, this agreement has a validity of 40 years. And if there's any force majeure, it goes up beyond that. Then we will be complaining. Of what's the point of complaining if we don't do anything about it?
Indeed. Thank you very much for that point, Mr. Ram. I think we've spent quite some time on the aspect of Guyana's take. And there's another interesting point in the report that I'd just like for us to touch on, Mr. Ram and Mr. Sanzillo. Mr. Lal, I believe you brought it up just a few moments ago. And it's the fact that over the next 5 years, the Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis estimates that the tax breaks given by Guyana will amount to roughly 1.7 billion or $340 million US per year. That's more than half of Guyana's 525 million budget deficit for 2021. Mr. Ram and Mr. Sanzillo, I would be happy to get your perspectives on the need for us to have more disclosures on the expenses we have under the PSA versus what we're actually getting from this deal. Would you say the government is failing us in its duties to be transparent in its reporting on these issues? Mr. Ram, I can start with you.
Kiana, you probably are aware that recently, not on hypothetical or future figures, but on actual figures for 2020, I've shown what the government will be paying.
Yes.
For Hess and CNOOC Nexen on their 2020 financial statements. Exxon, or Esso Exploration and Production Guyana Limited, has reported a tax loss. So incidentally, if there's a tax loss, then there's no tax. That or tax certificate would have to be paid. None. Which is why I'm saying it shows you that it's not something you could just tie down to figures. I think depending, to answer your question, Kiana, depending on what the price of oil is, and if the government starts to put any mechanisms in place to stop the wanton use of revenue from one well to explore for another well by applying conditions, then we're actually going to lose more. But what is happening, because we allow future expenses against current income, which accountants have a problem with usually, then even the tax figure is distorted.
Mr. Ram, you've closed on your point?
Yes, I've closed on my point. As I said, depending on what you don't know, anyone who studies, whether it's Global Witness, or any of the other oil experts, they will have to make assumptions about the future oil prices.
Perfect.
And as you know, that could be volatile, very, very volatile.
Yes, indeed. Mr. Sanzillo, what is your take based on the...
I basically concur. I think we have to. I can't assume that I know what Exxon or Hess or whatever files with the government of Guyana regarding a tax return. I'm not sure that it has to be that it relates to the financial statement that was filed. Even I don't know anymore. I just don't know. So I took what I understood to be the profits from the contract, which is the money. And so, but I understand that the Exxon could declare something differently, and that would impact the tax liability that's involved. I just make my assumptions because there is no transparency here, and the topic needs to be discussed, even though there is no governmental transparency or formal numbers. So, but in terms of the rising price of oil, I agree that that the issues become even more urgent if the price goes up. But my worries are even mounting then, because it doesn't appear that the government is in a position to adequately handle their own interests and to monitor the price of oil and the understanding of what comes in under each oil lift. What are the expenses that are being declared? How are they being assessed against the revenues? There is no demonstrable evidence to me that the government is prepared to handle their own interest here. They couldn't complete an audit of the prior legacy costs. And so what we're looking at is, and that's why I put out these numbers, even though I agree with Mr. Ram, you could challenge me all the way, but they are, consistently applied. But as the price of oil goes up, it will be, it becomes more an issue. I'm very concerned about this, that the contract is weak, as Mr. Ram has pointed out, and you just lose, and then you lose even more if you don't have people who are aggressively pursuing Guyana's interest at every single step of the way.
Kiana, from a business standpoint, I find this lack of ring fencing, not safeguarding, not protecting one project from another. I find it disgusting that you have a government who ought to and know better to fix this situation, and they're doing nothing about it. Chris?
And Mr. Ram has rightly pointed out earlier that there's no need for us to wait for renegotiation. He pointed out that we have the power, the minister has the power to do this right now. So indeed, I do agree with you that there is no reason for us to delay. So, Mr. Ram, is there any point that you'd like to add to that before I head to my final question?
I do want to say, if anyone is interested, I had a column, why ring fencing matters and why it doesn't matter. Yes. And I'm saying it doesn't matter because even though it's not in the agreement, you can put conditions. Each field is subject to a new production license. The other point I wanted to make for Mr. Zanzalo's information is that, fortunately or unfortunately, the accounts of companies are matters of public information. So if you were to go into the commercial registry in Georgetown, Guyana, you'll get the financial statements of SO, of S, CNOT, Nexen, Kaieteur News Limited, and all of that. The question, though, Mrs. Zanzalo, is, who put the figures into the financial statements? And how thorough are the auditors? And what kind of transfer pricing, what accounting basis? I mean, there's so many things.
Right.
This is why I've also argued we should have an independent petroleum commission to do the very things that any normal country would do to ensure that it is not shafted by any operator or any investor, not only in oil.
Indeed. With that said, I'd like to close with my final question, and it's also based on one of the findings of the report, or comments rather from the report. Mr. Sanzillo, you noted the unwillingness or the reluctance of the government to disclose how it is handling the payments of oil companies' taxes to the Guyana Revenue Authority. And this is also a matter that's been raised locally by Mr. Ram, the need for the government to be more transparent in how it's handling the liabilities of the production sharing agreement. And in light of this, in light of all the matters that we've raised here, can you offer us your concluding thoughts on how the tax liabilities raise even further issues about the fairness of the deal that we've signed?
Well, okay. The way the structure has been put together, I understand it, and I think Mr. Ram spelled it out better than I did on how the sort of a gimmick that we have here that we're dealing with, and the best way over time to handle something like that is for more disclosure, and that's what will be helpful. There are evidence within the contract that spells out that Exxon is filing an ongoing transaction and ongoing business numbers with the government, and that would be a good basis for public discussions if they were released on a regular basis, so that the public could understand it better and understand where there are real trade-offs and when there are real problems. Because without that, then you have people effectively fighting with themselves over things that are maybe inconsequential. So it's important. The transparency is just the overriding importance here, as far as I can see.
Thank you, Mr. Sanzillo. Mr. Ram, I'd like to frame the closing question just a bit differently for you on a point that you raised earlier on the need for us to perhaps move beyond speaking about these matters or complaining about these matters and start to take action. With that said, do you think the time has come for us to mount as Guyanese a legal challenge towards the tax liabilities in the PSA, particularly as it relates to paying the oil company's share of taxes from our share of profit oil?
I don't only think time has come. I think the time has been from day one. And unfortunately, both the government that signed the agreement, the 2016 agreement, and the successor government that is now administering the government and the sector, seems to be interested in reviewing the contract. It seems to me that it's more a question is drill, baby, drill. It doesn't matter what share Guyana gets, because we have so much. Even if we get 10%, 12%, 15%, it still is a lot. Now, in my view, no, you should mention how much you should have got. That's what you should be fighting for. What I would like to do, though, is, Kiana, I would like to say to you reporters and press people, use the Access to Information Act to demand information. You get that in any, you read the New York Times or the London Guardian, they will tell you something and say this information was obtained under the so-and-so. But our media do not seem to be willing to go that far. And that upsets me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for that point, Mr. Ram. Mr. Lal, would you like to offer some perspectives before we close?
Thank you, Mr. Zanzilo. Thank you, Mr. Ram. I think it was a nice discussion, and what is lacking here is the officials. We need the officials to be sitting around the table and have these type of discussions so the people of this country can get to understand where they stand and listen to their answers to the questions that are being posed. Mr. Ram, you should have said where we are heading with this tax issue. And I just wanted to tell you, Mr. Zanzilo, and the listeners, that I am ready to carry that fight to the court. I only hope Mr. Ram will help. Mr. Ram, are you going to help me?
Mr. Lau, it's not a fair question to ask a professional publicly.
Okay, we'll discard that piece. But Kiana, it was a beautiful little discussion that I wanted to make my point, and I will still leave here saying that Guyana is losing physically cash from that should have been in our pockets from Exxon taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Lal. With that said, Mr. Sanzillo and Mr. Ram, just to let you know, one of the most troubling aspects for us to really have a discussion on where oil and gas is concerned is really when it comes down to the numbers, the accounting, and really getting the experts who can explain many of these matters to us in a very simple form. And I do hope that we can have you back here sometime in the future to help us with a better understanding of other areas of not just the contract, but on matters related to what we can expect to gain from the oil and gas sector. So with that said, Mr. Ram, Mr. Sanzillo, thank you very much for your expertise and sharing your perspectives with us. I'm quite positive the public has learned a lot from what you've shared, and I do hope we can have you back again. Mr. Lal, thank you for co-hosting on Guyana's Oil and You, and I do know that your viewers are also looking forward to hearing your conclusion for the program tonight. So with that said, thanks again, gentlemen. Thank you for listening, and do have a good night.
Brian, thank you.